Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. I've discovered something about myself, something you might find perhaps a bit surprising, and that is that I'm bankrupt. And furthermore, I've discovered something about you. You are too. The only question at issue this evening is whether or not we'll admit it to ourselves. In fact, we're already in bankruptcy court, and some of us don't even know it. Now, by now, the thought is going through your mind, or the question is going through your mind, that sounds something like this. How can I be in bankruptcy court? I've never filed. I don't have an attorney. And actually, I may even have a little money left in my bank account at the end of the month. Well, the reality is we're not talking about a financial bankruptcy. The court that we're attached to is the court of eternity. And the debt that we owe is one that we can never pay, no matter how much money we have. In fact, we can't pay it no matter what our resources and assets are, whether that is in homes or land or, as I said, money or gold or silver or anything else of value. In fact, our removal from this court, our satisfaction of that debt and release by the court, can only be achieved by our acknowledgement of that debt's existence. In fact, our debt literally is the size of all eternity and far beyond our ability to ever pay off. In fact, the means that we have to satisfy that debt is nothing God would ever in any way consider to be adequate payment. In his book, The Applause of Heaven, Max Lucado phrases it this way. God does not save us because of what we've done. Only a puny God could be bought with tithes, and only an egotistical God would be impressed by our pain. Only a temperamental God would be satisfied with sacrifices, and only a heartless God would ever sell salvation, his precious salvation, to the highest bidders. And only a great God does for his children what they can't do for themselves. The reality is this. The only way that we can meet the demands of this bankruptcy court is our personal surrender. And it's upon this surrender, rather than God's conquest, that we receive God's life, God's delight. You see, God is not interested in beating us up or see us squirm like a bug under the bright light of a microscope. God's interested in seeing us come into relationship with him. And the first step into that release from debt that we so desperately need is a plea for help and an acknowledgement of our complete and moral failure. In fact, if we've ever experienced God's presence, if you've ever experienced that sense of his love, of his arms around you, of his presence in your life and the circumstances, it's only because you've already declared that you are spiritually bankrupt and are aware of your spiritual crisis. And you sought that divine release from the bondage of those moral and spiritual debts that we have mounted up. You know, that really only happens when we admit to God that our spiritual pockets, our spiritual wallets and purses are empty, and that we've exhausted every option that we ever thought we had. In truth, those options never existed to begin with. The problem is that as humans, we tend to want to work things out ourselves. Of course, we've always got Satan whispering in our ears that we don't need God, that we can do it on our own. But the reality is we cannot. And it's only when we finally realize that and realize that we don't deserve justice from God that we really begin to plead for his mercy. And it's then that we are heard by the Father. It's then that we are released from the demands and the bonds and the bondages of the bankruptcy court of heaven. In Luke chapter 1, verse 50, Jesus says this, and I'm reading from the Passion Translation. God will show his mercy forever and ever to those who worship and serve him. The prophet in the Old Testament said his mercies are new every morning. And the writers of the New Testament would add to that those mercies are given freely to those who are willing to admit that they desperately need them and surrender themselves to God's grace and mercy. It is my sincere hope today that you have experienced that you've experienced what we know in Christianity as salvation. If you haven't, if you've never experienced that, and you sense that that bankruptcy that I'm speaking to today is something that you are experiencing right now, your release is simple. You simply have to admit to the Father that you recognize your spiritual bankruptcy and that you throw yourself upon the mercy of the court. Your defense attorney, the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, is standing there to walk you through the process and to guarantee you a release from that court of eternity. A release from bondage, a release from eternal bondage into the Father's presence, and an eternal sense of release and grace. My prayer for you today is that you will accept that if you never have. My prayer is that you will find, as so many of the rest of us have, that the things that have contributed to our spiritual bankruptcy, our moral bankruptcy, are never worth. Do not begin to approach the worth of what the Father has to offer us. And with that thought, I leave you tonight. Be blessed, and may God's blessings and favor rest upon you. And I will see you next week in the Pastor Study.